you have a much cooler background than I have. You have your lovely Hartwell, ex-Hartwell estate vineyard in the background.
It's just actually fake, Antonio. That's a wallpaper.
That's fake. Okay. It makes me very envious because, I haven't been on a plane or gone anywhere for longer than probably my entire adult life at this point.
Well, you're welcome out here anytime.
So it's nice to see the sun. It's nice to see Napa Valley. Thanks for joining us. We're just going to have a really, I think, a really fun conversation. And I know you've opened up some wine. I've opened up some wine, but they're not the usual suspects. So we're going to keep people in suspense for now. And phone. I should turn my phone off because I always leave my phone on.
Yeah.
Worst habit, right? And as always, Vinous Live is designed to really bring people together, especially right now when the world is a little bit still topsy-turvy. And so what we'd love to do is get your questions for everyone who's watching, because it just helps us weave them into those questions into the conversation, make it as interactive as possible, which is ultimately our goal. So please give us your questions. We'll try to get through them as many as possible. When we get them at the end, it's kind of like this mad rush of questions and it's like, can't get to them all. So please give us your questions and we're going to dive right in. I think you both have individually really unique backgrounds. Scott, I met you, I think the first time in 2011 or so. You have a military background. You did the humblest jobs in Napa Valley. Now you own one of the elite estates in Napa Valley. What was the path and what was the wine that kind of set it off?
Big question.
And a Harvard MBA.
Yeah, well, I wasn't smart enough to get into to MIT, so
I didn't get into Harvard.
I had to float down the river and beg to get in at Harvard. It was I come from a family of dairy farmers in Wisconsin, and I think as a kid you want to get as far away from that as possible. And so the first chance I got to go to college, I went to the Air Force Academy, and it felt like it was a ticket out of the Midwest. I graduated May of 01 and 9/11 happened and it changed a lot for everybody, obviously, but I ended up spending a fair amount of time overseas. And I was, coming from an agricultural background, I think food was really important. My mom is a great cook. And so wine sort of became the natural extension of a meal. The rotating aircraft that would take us in and out of theater would often stop either at Ramstein, Germany or Aviano, Italy. And as you know way better than me, Antonio, from Aviano, it's a few hours drive to Piedmont. And so inevitably the rotator plane would break down for one part or another. And they'd say, okay, your flight back to the US is delayed. And so I just rent a car and drive around. And I didn't, of course, speak any Italian. And I just would show up at various places and try tasting wine. And I think that was sort of, I fell in love with wine through the hills of Barolo and Barbaresco. And in some ways, I think there's some similarities to Napa in terms of the fog and the undulating hills and so forth. And so when I got out of the military, I went to business school. I was trying to figure out what to do next, but I already had this burning passion for wine. And so I figured I had to figure out something to do. I wasn't smart enough to go into finance or tech or what everybody else was doing at business school, but happened to meet Jack Cakebread literally my first month on campus. He came and did a tasting. And I walked up to him after the tasting and I remember saying, Mr. Cakebread, my name is Scott and I'm interested in wine, but I'm also interested in the business of wine. And turns out he was in the Air Force as well, back in the Korean War. And so I think there was at least some connection there. And probably a week or so later, I got a call. I remember where I was walking across the bridge back to my apartment. And I got a phone call from his assistant. And she said, I have Mr. Cakebread on the line for you. And I said, hello. And I was kind of caught off guard. And Jack said, I was thinking about our conversation when you came up to me after that tasting. And I was wondering what you're doing for winter break. And I said, well, I'm going to go home, see my folks or do something, whatever you do when you're get a vacation from school. And he said, well, if you're really serious about wine, why don't you come out to Napa? I'll put you up in the vineyard house and we'll put you to work and we'll see if you're cut out for it. And, from that moment, I spent my spring break, summer break, winter breaks flying out to Napa, interning at Cakebread. And it was never like an official internship. It was sort of the unpaid, just kind of figure it out as you go. But Jack was an incredible mentor. And through that, he was the door that got me into the wine business.
And
So
then
roundabout story that somehow involves, you know, some combination of the military, a little bit of luck, running into Jack Cakebread, and then somebody who was willing to take me under his wing and give me a chance.
but then you ended up at Mr. Harlan's doorstep.
Well, so Jack used to have this group. He called it the Lunch Bunch, and he would literally get together with all these legends of the industry, and it was Bill Harlan was at this lunch, Bart Arajo, Michael Mondavi, Joe Phelps when he was alive, Jim Barrett when he was alive. You know, all these guys are sitting there at lunch, and then Jack invited me to one of these, and I sit down, and I'm like, I don't belong. Like, what am I doing here? I figured maybe he had me there to help him clean. Maybe he wanted me to clean glasses or you know, serve the food, because it was like I didn't belong sitting at that table. And but it was amazing. And in typical Bill fashion, one of those lunches, I sat next to him, and he said, "What are you doing with your life?" And you know, I'm sure whatever my answer was insufficient. And he said, "Well, you know, if you want to do something significant, you know, why don't you come work with me?" And it was hard to say no to Bill. So that's how I ended up there when we first met.
Wow, that's so amazing. That's so cool. Such a cool story. Well, we'll get to Realm in a second, but I want to hear how Benoit from Bordeaux ends up in Napa Valley.
Well, thank you, Antonio. Happy to join you and give you a quick rundown. Grew up in Lyon. My mom's born in Bordeaux, so every vacation as a young kid, we're in Bordeaux, and always grew up around wines on the table, typical European family. The wine get bored a lot. Never had an interest at first, to be honest. Was pursuing like mechanics, electronics, tried to enroll in the army to be a fighter pilot. My uncle was fixing the engines of the jets in the French army.
Can you see Benoit in the army? I mean, come on.
Look at the haircuts.
I think it's still in. You're still of the generation where it was probably mandatory, right? It's not mandatory anymore, or is it still?
To avoid it, to be honest, because I stayed at school for a long time. I went and enrolled in a master science chemistry. Then I went and towards the university is pretty flex in France. So I was able to do a lot of small work, construction, road work, and end up in a mobile bottling line, going around Bordeaux and discover really a passion for wine. The first time I met like people that were passionate, doing the same thing, 35 years, 40 years. And they were like, you got to taste this, you got to taste that. Oh, you come here like this. And it was fascinating for me to watch, going from you work at the bank, people don't want to go. And then suddenly you work around the vineyards and the wine industry, and the passion was striking. So to me, I said, that's got to be my career. So from chemistry, I succeed to branch into like 2 years of research and the wine. So I enrolled in the University of Bordeaux, get my winemaker diploma. And through that time, I was able to work in every kind of step, like waiter, gather, like, you know, that pour wine at the weddings. And honestly, it was striking because the wine industry regroup everybody, and the passion is really the common link. So from that time, you know, going in Bordeaux was strange, but coming from like a family that have nothing to do with wine, the first question was, so are your parents into the wine? And I said, no. I said, so why you want to get into this? It's like, well, it's just obvious, the passion. And so through my studies, fast forward that I get to meet Michel Rolland, and I told him, I said, you know, I would love to see something before dedicate my life into Bordeaux, like something different. And he said, go to Napa, you will love it. It's amazing. So, and it was at that time, you know, 2004, a little bit against the grain of Bordeaux. So I was like, really, you want to go there? I'm not sure. You should go to Dominus Opus 1 because that's all they knew, right, from a teacher perspective. And I'm glad I did, because so Michel, through his connection, I mean, we know who he worked with, the Harlan, Screaming, Dalavan, etc. I say, no, there's a lot of small producers. And he already had embedded in me, it's like, it's a little bit like Burgundy, like you're going to see a lot of small producers, a lot of different terroir, and a very open mind. And I'm very fortunate that I did follow the advice and came here for 3 months working for Andy Erickson, and 3 months become 18 months. And then I went in South Africa and came back and never left really. And I'm here, American now. So.
Oh yeah. Excellent.
Yeah. Married, Nikita.
Wow. That's a lot of changes.
Yeah. See what happens when you don't come to Napa for a little while?
That's it.
I've been missing out. It's been like 6 months. It's terrible. All right. Well, I'm going to fix that. But anyway, let's talk about you because, all right. So that gets you to California, Napa Valley, Benoit. And then how walk us through the timeline of how you both end up at Realm, because it sort of happens around the same time, right? 2011, 2012-ish timeline, which is kind of around when I started tasting these wines, actually. I mean, I knew them before, but I mean, on a more rigorous level.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, Benoit and I, he arrived in 04. I came sort of in 06. We'll skip the stories around how we first met. There's a funny story there someday, but, so we kind of knew of each other. He was doing his thing, I was doing mine. And then when I decided to leave Harlan, it was really, I kind of wanted to do my own thing. And I felt like maybe partly because I was a terrible employee, and I had an opinion and a perspective on what I wanted to do. And Benoit certainly is a worse employee than me. And so he had this sort of entrepreneurial vibe. And so we started a conversation about, maybe trying to do something else. And, at that point, Benoit was living with Juan Mercado, one of the co-founders of Realm. And I knew Juan just from being around in the Valley. And so I quickly came to the conclusion that rather than starting from scratch, it might be better to get involved in something that had some vineyard sources, because, it was even tough then, let alone now, that access to fruit, you don't just come by that. And so the three of us sat down, Juan, Benoit, and I, at a lunch, and talked about what Realm was at that point. And it turns out that at that point, I think Juan had done an extraordinary job cultivating some relationships, but the business was struggling. Essentially, it was bankrupt. And so we sat down and had this opportunity to essentially restart the company. And for me, it was already getting access to Touquette and Dr. Crane, vineyards that I couldn't just walk into Andy's office and get access to. And so we came up with this idea to effectively restart Realm.
Andy Becker now that you're talking about.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. So, Juan, Benoit, and I basically sat down and said, can we do something together? Benoit having a relationship with Juan had already started helping him out in 2011. We couldn't quite pull all the stuff together to get the deal done until early 2012. In fact, we were, you can tell this part of the story, but we were 21 days from, you talk about the role that Andy Beckstoffer has played in Realm, and even those early days. We were 21 days from losing the fruit in 2012. If we didn't kind of reorganize the business, pay off some old invoices and kind of reestablish ourselves. But he was willing to take a chance on us a second time. And I think that, we were fortunate to be able to have that fruit to work with right away in 2012.
Yeah. I mean, I think when people look at Realm now, it's maybe hard to remember some of those early days, but obviously starting a business or even taking an existing business and ramping it up, it involves an enormous amount of risk, an enormous amount of self-confidence. But you also had to deal with a fire. Some of the wines that you bought in inventory were tainted that you didn't really know at the time. And obviously in any business, there's always things that you can't know and you just find out and you just have to deal with it. But walk us through those early days, because I don't think a lot of people know how hard it is. And when I look at Realm and I think about Napa Valley, there's a lot of people out there making these small lot 250, 300 case production wines with purchased fruit in shared spaces, which, can yield really great results. I mean, the first Colgan wines were done like that. So, I mean, it's not like that is not a barrier to success, but it's not optimal either, especially if you think about the long term. And when I think about wineries that have started that way and then become estate owners like you guys have, I mean, I'm sure that our viewers will correct me and add some more names, but I can really only think of Marc Aubert and Luc Morlaix as kind of people who are like, or maybe even, and Philippe Melka, maybe you would say, that started off sort of buying fruit and now are like real estates. And the reality is you probably have to do a little bit of both, but that transformation is pretty rare in Napa Valley. So tell us about those early days and kind of those bumps. I mean, I imagine that there were a lot of sleepless nights in the beginning there.
I mean, pick what story we want to tell here. It was, first of all, I think we're very blessed to be able to sit where we sit today and be able to look back and even tell these stories. I was talking to a friend the other day who's a very successful entrepreneur, and he said, you know, starting a business and being an entrepreneur, and Antonio, you know, if you think about it, you essentially started Vinous. You left a very successful, established career to go start your own enterprise around the same time that we restarted Realm. And, you know, so this friend said, basically starting a business, being a successful entrepreneur is surviving all the moments, and it's not just one, all the moments when you really shouldn't make it. And that, I think, sums up, if you talk about Realm in 2012 and 13 and 14, we really shouldn't have made it. Now, Benoit's going to tell you, Scott, you're wrong. There's no such thing as luck. We earned it. We scraped by. And he's right. We did all those things, but we got lucky. You know, had it not been the 12 vintage when it all came together, it's hard to say that we'd be sitting here. The business was on its back. I didn't know how to make payroll. I personally paid for the corks, the glass, and the capsules to put the 2010 vintage in bottle before I'd even bought the company. And so at that point, Benoit said, well, how's that going to work, Scott? If you don't end up closing, you're going to own the glass, but not the wine inside the bottle. I was like, I said, well, don't tell my wife, because I didn't ask her whether to do this or not. But you know, but that's what it takes. You have to survive those moments and believe in yourself and believe in what you're doing. And, you know, I think for us, it was the opportunity to build something. And so trying to figure out how to make payroll. We bought a plastic table and folding chairs. We rented some space in St. Helena. That's, you know, to kind of recalibrate the team. We started to make a couple of hires. I remember sitting with the growers in 2012 in the summer with Benoit, one particular grower who's become very close to us now. And you would think that they must have thought we were talking. I mean, it's hard enough to understand Benoit's English on a good day, but they must have thought we were talking Russian or some other foreign language, because they were like, you two are crazy. You barely paid off your bills. You know, now you're going to come in and tell me how to do my farming. But, you know, it was scrappy. It was entrepreneurial. And, you know, there's probably plenty of moments that we shouldn't have made it. But I think through all of that, there was a focus and a passion for trying to make wine at the highest level. And I think if you look at it for us, like I had exposure, I'd walked in a lot of vineyards. Benoit had made wine a lot of places. And so there was a context and a history there that we were starting from scratch in terms of the business, but we weren't starting from scratch in terms of the knowledge and the experience and some of those relationships that we'd cultivated. But I don't know, what would you say in terms of those first few years?
I say, Antonio, in a nutshell, I mean, Scott could have been working at Harlan. I could have been, you know, I was talking to be the winemaker at Screaming Eagle. And I remember having a discussion with Michel, and he said, why you're not taking the job? You're crazy. And I say, ultimately, is not what I want to do. It's like you. It's like you're in a great place. You're at the Wine Advocate, but you know you can do your thing. You know you want to do Vinous. And I think you have a calling, you have a fire inside, a desire to do your own thing. Inspired by other successful story, like we hear, you know, your Vinous was great with Andy Becker and some other successful stories like this. Is like that fuel, that fire, that, you know, it's like, you know, I want to have my shot at this. I want to tell myself that I could be one of those successful stories, perhaps too. So, and I think that's what the spirit was there. Then there's hard work, of course. There's a luck, certainly, but there's the desire to push. And I think to tell you a story that perhaps enlighten the things, like when Michel tell us, you are fucking crazy, but I want to have fun with you. Is
this a PG-13 or an R-rated version?
I will make an exception.
I'm sorry. I love it.
It's okay. Everybody should be 21. So I think that goes beyond anything with a PG.
Okay. All right.
And I saw that we have people in France texting me. So, I mean, you have a lot of viewers. So it's like, oh my God. No, so I think it's the passion that drive, and perhaps if you think rationally, most likely it doesn't happen, in my view. You got to be delirious at some point and take the chance.
I remember that conversation with Michel, because obviously he was has been an incredible mentor to Benoit, and in a different way, I feel like he's been a mentor to me. I got to meet him through my time with the Harlan family, and I remember him saying, guys, what is this Realm thing? I honestly think he agreed to work with us because he felt sorry for us. He's like, Scott, you should have stayed at Harlan and Benoit. You should go where I tell you to go. But if you're not going to do that, then I can't have you guys embarrass yourselves. And so I'm going to come in and help you with a little blending. And, but you have all those stories back then. I'll tell another brief one only because it'll probably get me in trouble. I showed Bart Arajo one of the early business plans. Did I ever tell you this? So I showed Bart an early business plan for Realm. This, we were already in it. This was probably somewhere in 2013, trying to figure out, I'm still trying to figure out how to make payroll. We'd made the 12 vintage. And so I think that was the thing that kept us going. We're tasting the wine out of barrel. And I think we all felt like, wow, there's something good here. But I showed Bart a business plan, and all he said to me, he put it down and he looked up at me and he said, you had a pretty good job at Harlan, didn't you? And he didn't say you should go back and ask for that, but there was like
a strong hint.
I don't know about this thing. And, and we've laughed about it now. So I think, and obviously I appreciated that perspective because it reinforces just how hard it is to do this. And it from your, I'm sure you could name 5 moments when Vinous should have failed. But it didn't, or more, but it didn't because of that spirit. And I think that's been a big part of our story that, when you look around now, I think it's easier to maybe see, I wouldn't say success because we're not there yet. We're still trying to get there. But we're further along than we were 8 years ago. But if you see it now and you see, some new tanks or some new equipment, we didn't have any of that in 12 and 13. And I think so the question becomes, as we've evolved, like to still tap into that same spirit and that same hunger, but to take it to the next level. And I think, you mentioned this, and maybe this is where you were going with your comment in terms of that evolution and transformation from not owning land, being virtual to a domain. And our view was always that we needed to own land to control our own destiny. I think if you think about the great wines of the world, there's plenty of things that are different, and there's a few things that are the same. And one of those is control over the land and the ability to be a steward of it, to think long-term, to farm it exactly the way we want. And so we knew that was something we needed to strive for. And we just needed to wait for the right moment or the right opportunity to present itself.
Yeah.
Cool. Benoit's got text messages with all your viewers here.
So Thomas, you close it, like you see like their hair is going off. And over say you have a potty mouth. So the comments are flowing. It's good. It's good. I'm watching.
Is Thomas going to come to California now and make wine?
I don't know. Yeah. So hey, he's doing fantastic over there. So hey, Thomas, we're waiting for you.
Okay. All right. So you're making wine from a number of like crown jewel vineyards. Some of them were obviously like in the portfolio when you arrived, Touquette, Dr. Crane. But in recent years, obviously you have Hartwell, which you bought, but what about things like Ho Yi and Upper Range? I mean, what are you looking for and what makes a great vineyard for you? Is there kind of like a checklist, or is it kind of like a gut feeling? I mean, because some of these places are new, like Upper Range is completely new. So you have to kind of go on some instinct, right? So what is it that, when you're looking for sites that you want to add, because you've added quite a few, what drives that?
Go first of all. So Antonio, I think like some of the things like Hartwell for me have been here since 2004. So it's kind of known. For Farella, like we had the relation prior with Juan and the relation with Scott. So it's known. For Upper Range, honestly, it was presented with our relation to the Bettinelli family that farmed for us, with us on the estate. And we went and see when it was just raw land, and we look at the maps, we look at the elevation, we take in consideration everything you can, but I think we believe in the people, we believe in the place. So we decided to go, especially for us, for 18 acres, that kind of the same 100 feet higher than Dalla Valley and same orientation. And if you want to show the map, that's perfect. Yeah. So I think we try to go with a little bit of mixing everything you said. So the person, number one, it gotta be the people that we love to work with and we believe in. So the Bettinelli family is amazing people to work with, and you can see them with Sleeping Lady and everything they're doing now. They took over Ecoton, Torre Vilos, the farming over there. So fantastic people to work with. Then we narrow it down to the soil, the elevation, the spot, and based on the knowledge that we had fruit from Turnbull prior that allowed us to think that we're gonna have great fruit coming. And I think the farming allowed us to believe we're gonna have more consistency, more control, and we should achieve like great quality wines, be inspired by Maya, of course, one of the benchmark of the valley. So. And for Hui, I think after that, there's opportunities that come our way with.
I'm just going to show where this is, because this is kind of an area that a lot of people don't know. And you mentioned the Bettinellis, you know, the wines from Sleeping Lady, because I think one of the things that I like the most about what I get to do is I get to taste like a lot of people's wines from Sleeping Lady, a lot of people's wines from, I don't know, Vine Hill Ranch or whatever. And that is one vineyard where the quality of the wines has just gone up like in a massive way, just in the last like 3 or 4 years, but like everybody's wine, you know?
But that's just farming, yeah. That's the testimony to the Bettinelli family. So here we're on the Victor. That's where we are.
That's here. So this is outside of the Rutherford AVA on a ridge here. It's a spectacular location. So will that be a single vineyard wine, or what do you think? Do you know yet what you're going to do?
It's in the discussions. You know, I think one of these things, it takes years to cultivate. We're still working with some young vine fruit. And so we'll want to be careful and thoughtful as to when that happens. But yes, I think the intent long-term was that that may be worthy of its own designation. But it's going to take us a few years to kind of figure out and tease out the personality of that wine and that site. But we're really excited about it. But you know, you make a bet years ago and it takes 5-10 years to see if it ever paid off. So nothing like high risk, but
that's why I don't make wine. Everybody always asks me, why don't you make wine? That is the reason why. I
can understand that. You know, embedded in all those sleepless nights wasn't just whether the business is going to work. It's kind of like, you know, did you bet on the right site? Is the wine, you know, the wine that you have in barrel that you're tasting, is it going to be good or better as you put it in a bottle? How does it evolve? And you know, you're making decisions that the result is often delayed several years. And so even today we talk about this, like, you know, 8 years into this journey, we won't establish success for us until we can go back and taste wines with 10 and 20 years of age and see how they evolve and say, okay, no, those wines are holding up well. They're evolving nicely. That's, you know, what success and greatness looks like in the wine business. But you got to be able to survive the intervening 10 or 20 or 30 years to get there.
Yeah, it's true. So this is you should be able to see the map of Pritchard Hill here.
Yeah.
And Hoyi is one of the newer wines also in the range.
Yeah, we started working with that fruit in 2013. And I think for us, it's, you know, you look at that whole portfolio. Benoit mentioned, obviously, the relationship with the owner or the grower, and the sites themselves. You know this better than me, Antonio, but just because of your perspective on the world of wine. But I heard Paul Roberts talk about this a little bit when you interviewed him, that I think Napa has more in common, that the language we will start to use talking about Napa will be more akin to the way you talk about Burgundy today. Obviously, it's Bordeaux varietals in a lot of cases, but I think that this notion of a sense of place and how sites evolve, and is that east facing or south facing? What's the elevation? What's the exposure? What soil type do you have? And the variation in the variety here is extreme, but it's almost like the exciting part is in those nuances and those details. So when the opportunity came up to work with something on Pritchard Hill, that was not something we had in the portfolio. And you know, I don't think we need to be in every appellation, but I think that what we said from the beginning was the vision was that Realm isn't one wine. It's meant to be this portfolio that collectively reflects the diversity of Napa Valley. And if we're going to do that, then we need to have wines that taste different, that come from different places, have their own story and their own reason for being. And Huyi certainly added to that fabric, you know, added to that diversity for us.
Yeah, so this is sort of the heart of Pritchard Hill. Well, this sector of Pritchard Hill, Colgan and David Arthur, Martinez, Ovid, and there's Hoyi and Brand, of course. So that's pretty cool.
Those are sites that you're talking about, you know, 10 or, you know, in some cases at most 20 years of history. if you compare that to Burgundy and centuries of history, we're still figuring it out. And that's the exciting part, is that the best is yet to come, that there is the level of precision and nuance and detail, is going to take time, but but that's the exciting part of it.
Yeah. I mean, that's what Bob told me when he asked me to cover California wines for the Wine Advocate. He said, you're going to go crazy with the pace of change. And that is true. I mean, just keeping up with all of these sites and the wines coming from these sites is really, quite amazing. I mean, as I'm sure know, Colgan has a new parcel right around here somewhere that's in development. And I certainly hope you're right about the greater focus on site-specific wines and places, because that's good for maps.
So we tried to buy land, and you decided to do a map project, but both of them are going to take decades to probably pay off in the long run. But that's that's a long-term investment. And when you did those maps, I thought that was an amazing effort. In fact, I want to talk to Mr. Masnaghetti, because I saw he just did a book on Barolo. He's got a website with all these flyby views, and I think we need to have him do one of those for Napa Valley.
Yeah, I think that's already in the works.
Okay. Well, you can break news here.
As long as we don't get upset any neighbors or anybody. I mean, I did get a couple of angry phone calls while we were doing the maps of like, we're ruining, we're making it impossible for people to buy land because land prices are going to go up, and some other person kicked me off a private road, threatened to call the police.
At the end of the booth.
Yeah, the next Zoom session we do, we're going to have you disclose all. Right?
Yeah. So there's been some, but I think one of the things that's interesting about wine people is that most people, especially people making really beautiful wines, have wide-ranging interests that are not just limited to the place where they work or the place where they've grown up, or the wines of their friends necessarily. But one of the things that I think is the most fun with wine people is to talk about wines from other regions that they like. And I know that one of the regions that you're both very fond of is Champagne. So instead of like opening up realm wine, which would be sort of like the standard thing, and we can do that anytime and it's fine, we both open Champagne. So why don't we take a little detour from Napa Valley and talk about Champagne a little bit? And why don't you go first, because you have a really beautiful wine open.
Yeah, you go for it, Benoit.
It's here.
Oh, okay.
Well, Antonio, I remember when you came to Hardware back to the days, and I think it was verse 12. You came, you taste, and it was late, and we had some pizza coming, and we had a little quick gathering, and you were on your way out. I said, Champagne. So, what it is? Like, what? Salon. I said, oh, really? Which vintage? 97. And it was a Magnum. And
we couldn't afford another Magnum, Antonio, but we did have a 750. So
zero being consumed.
I think you just wanted to open that. Find an excuse to open that wine that you've been hanging on to for a while. No, I mean, obviously Salon is a really special wine. And obviously it's Chardonnay from the Côte Blanc, and it's, very small production. It's not made every vintage. And I think it's interesting that you picked that wine, because I picked a wine that has something similar, which is the idea of wines. Champagne is this, I think, of all the regions in the world, Champagne is the region where you see the greatest disparity between agricultural approach to making wine. You have this obviously everywhere. You have it in Bordeaux, you have it in Burgundy, the really very, very elite estate, and then the artisan. But in Champagne, it's just magnified because of all of the marketing dollars that are, put to work at all of the really, really fancy houses, while the artisan side of Champagne is just like Burgundy, just like Piedmont. It's often farmers, you're often tasting in people's homes. It is really that direct experience. And Salon is interesting because it has that image, but the production is tiny and not made in every vintage. So that's your wine. And then I get this, huh?
What do you get?
I wanted to do a Roederer wine, because Roederer is another house that is known obviously for Cristal and these glamorous wines like that, but they're actually the biggest farmer of biodynamic vineyards, organic and biodynamic vineyards in Champagne. What I think is interesting about this wine, the Brut Nature, is it's only made. First of all, it's Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and Pinot Meunier co-fermented, which is very unusual. And they only make it in the vintages when the harvest allows for those grapes to be picked, more or less at the same time, which, as you know, is complicated, and it's not very easy to achieve that in your vineyard. And it's got no dosage, which means by definition, it's going to be only possible to make that wine in a riper year where you're going to get more generosity out of the fruit. And so I think Roederer is an interesting house because you're in Champagne, but there's an artisan side to these wines too. It's not just the glitz, There's plenty of glitz behind Cristal, but there's a lot of diligence, research, focus on non-interventional farming and all that. But in the Brut Nature, it's much more of an adventurous wine. The no dosage. It's much more like a grower champagne, really.
Yeah.
So,
oh, great choice. And I think that's one of the things we love about Champagne. Well, I mean, I think that the love really started on a more practical level, where it was like after you taste young barrel samples of Cabernet all day long, you need something to freshen up. And so Champagne just kind of became the natural choice. But I think as you dive into it, as you said, I think a lot of consumers at first glance, you have this impression of the big houses and it's a brand driven industry. And sure, there is a component of that, but I think as you meet the principles behind it and you start to see where it's going, there's a renaissance, there's a focus on the land, there's a focus on stewardship, there's a focus on precision and maybe even this concept of terroir in Champagne. Imagine that.
Yeah.
Which I think is exciting for us. And you have to believe that there's some component of that or other wine regions. Obviously, Benoit's from Bordeaux. We've spent some time there together tasting Burgundy. You think about these other kind of benchmark regions that we're constantly looking for inspiration and ideas in a variety of places. Somehow these wines have a collective influence, not just on us, but I would say everybody in Napa. That Napa Valley is one of those rare regions that you talk to all winemakers and they have a curiosity for the great wines of the world.
Yeah.
And I don't yet go to restaurants in Bordeaux with our friend Jeffrey Davies and drink Napa wines because Jeffrey isn't a very good sales guy, so he doesn't want to put Napa wines in Bordeaux restaurants. But no, I'm just giving him a hard time. You don't see, if you go to Barolo, you might see a little bit of Champagne, but you don't see necessarily the wines of the world. And I think that's one of the things that the community, the wine community and food and wine and hospitality community in Napa Valley has done an extraordinary job of is cultivating, cuisine and wines that are at a world-class level from all over. And so that has to have an influence over time on hopefully making Napa Valley wines and what we do in our craft better and better every year.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I think we should take some questions because we got some really good ones. And the first question is from Benoit. Oh, you have a notepad. Oh my God, that's so serious.
Prepare.
There's no test afterwards, I promise.
Hello.
It's about which wine you enjoy making the most. I know it's a hard question, but while you think about that, I want to tell everybody a little story about the first time I tasted with you at Hartwell, because it was in January.
It's a trap. It's an insider question.
It was in January, which is not a time I usually go to Napa Valley, but it was in January, and I went to speak at this Fruition Sciences conference, where I gave I think the keynote speech in their conference in January. It's like a harvest wrap up, and Fruition Sciences, for people who may not know, is a company that does a lot of research on sap flow and vineyard technologies for managing irrigation. And I'm sure a lot of other things that are way above my head, because I sat there during that conference and I swear I understood like nothing. I mean, it was just like so technical, so complex, all about, vineyard management and using technology to understand your vineyard and so on and so forth. And then I gave my speech. And then the next day I showed up at Hartwell and I tasted all these wines. And at the end, there was this one wine and it didn't have a name. It was just in a bottle. And Benoit said, "This is the first vintage of this wine." And I'm like, okay. And that's what I love the most. When sometimes people say, like, what do you love the most about your job? It's moments like this, which I've been lucky to have a lot of. So there's this wine, it's in a shiner, which means without a label. First vintage, Benoit says, "I don't even know what this wine's going to be called exactly." And I tasted this wine and I knew right away that it was fantastic. And a lot of times people will say, you know, how long does it take you to taste the wine, or, you know, what's the process like? And for me, it's very immediate. I mean, if you ask Michel Rolland, he said, you know, you taste right away. You know, it's not like you're sitting there deliberating. He's always like, you trust your first instinct. La Louise Leroy has said the same thing. So I think that there's a lot of people who taste this way, and it's like sort of very fast. Anyway, I taste this wine and I knew it was fantastic. I was like, what is this wine? And that wine turned out it was 2011 Cata, which had about, I don't know, 15% Petit Syrah. It was so distinctive. And that was the first time I tasted all of your wines at Hartwell. And so now I've given you enough time to think about your answer to this question, which I'm sure is a tough question, but is there a wine that you enjoy making the most, or maybe a site that you feel real affinity to, or a historical attachment to a place?
Well, I think if you talk like to follow on what you say, if you talk about Cata, what is striking there is that Petit Syrah, 60-year-old plants, dry farm, and it's unbelievable because there's nothing really you have to do else than doing just the little manutention, like you said, non-intervention in farming, and that gives you a wine that's exceptional. Some of the vineyards, you got to lead a bit more. So Dr. Crane is the other one that comes to mind that say almost no intervention and the wine is incredible. And then there's, when you take more like we have an estate behind us, it's all to make that so that we lean in towards a vineyard like this, that's, you don't have to intervene. So we will go like biodynamic and organic, and it's just low, almost to zero intervention. And I think that's always the goal. So some vineyards are a bit easier than some others. We love, honestly, like all the wines. Some kind of, we could say, make themselves. Some we just need to spend more time, more attention, like work on the structure and help but it's the same dedication no matter what is Tempest to Absurd. And that's what I think is fun about the business that we're in. It's a longevity. It's a long-term investment that you commit to in the land, and ultimately, like the winery become just a vessel to process the grapes. So I love, personally, if you ask me what I love, Crane has been, I remember because joining Réam was known for Tourcalon. You know, at that time, Tourcalon was incredible. And I always have been like, Crane, it shocked me to see the beauty of that wine, the complexity. Moonracer, now here, the estate, the Favela. So
it's a lot, yeah.
Yeah, so I want to show this so people know where we are here. This is the vineyard. I like this vineyard a lot too. I don't know why, really, technically. I like the wines from Dr. Crane. And here, it's the southern part of St. Helena. Let me just see. Hold on, I'm just gonna boom it up a little bit.
West side.
But that's here. There's Dr. Crane.
Yeah.
There's the high school, which has got to be like the most expensive real estate for a school in the United States.
We often talk about that when we drive down that road and look at, there's a few houses on the north side of the road, and man, that's some pretty expensive real estate there.
Yeah, so that's Dr. Crane for folks who don't know exactly where that is. And you mentioned a few things quickly that I just want to make sure that we have clear for everybody who's watching. Moonracer is the wine you make off the estate in Stag's Leap, correct?
Yeah, right here.
Okay. And there's a question about how the construction is coming along at the estate from Christopher. What can you tell us about the construction?
Don't do it again. No, I think when we bought the property, and you kind of got to go back. We closed on the property on December 31st of 2015. And that was probably the most significant transformation or milestone that we've had yet on the journey, because I think you go from making sure that you're still going to have access to fruit the next year or the year after that to owning a piece of property. And I think, all of a sudden there's a foundation here on which to grow. But when we bought it, we knew there was a lot of work to do. I think the fact that Benoit had been on the property since, been the winemaker since 06, I guess, that he had a history and a context here that even though Realm was relatively new to the site, Benoit had this history. And so Moonracer, we benefited right off the bat in terms of, he had a mindset on which blocks he thought were the best performing. And he also had a perspective on the blocks that were the worst performing that had the greatest potential. And so those are the blocks we went after first in terms of a replant, which is including the block behind us, this hillside block here. The site is incredibly complex. We've got east-facing slopes, we've got a north-facing slope, we've got south, we've got southeast, an elevation change from 200 and change to 500 feet. And so when you're dealing with that, it just, the other way to say it from a construction standpoint is every one of those things adds dollars and time and complexity to the construction. It wasn't like we bought a flat piece of ground. But that was the potential, that we're on this hillside on Wapo Hill, and we knew the winery needed some investment in terms of infrastructure. So we started that design process right away in 2016. And, you know, here we are 4 something odd years later. We're almost done with the first phase, which will give us some additional barrel storage capacity, a new barn for fruit storage. We've upgraded all of the utilities, you know, just more power, better wastewater system, not the sexy stuff, but the stuff that actually goes into making better wine. And I actually think, you know, Antonio, you've experienced this. If you make wine in Napa Valley today and you don't have a generator, then, you know, it's at some point it's like you missed the boat. So, you know, those were things that we've had in place early on, because we realized we needed a site that was more resilient. And so, you know, I think those things are pretty important, even though they don't make the headlines these days. So we're almost done with phase 1. I think we've pretty much stretched the team to the max in terms of our ability and to navigate the construction, because it's not a flat piece of ground. We essentially, the way I equate it to like fixing the airplane mid-flight. We had to keep making wine. The team's still here. For a while, we were still receiving guests. At some point last year, we had to shut down hospitality because it was just too much. I was afraid somebody was going to get run over by a dump truck or a bulldozer, or, you know, have their car hit by somebody. And so it was just like, shut it down and let's focus on the construction and get it right. So we're excited. I think it was a big, we bit off a lot. It's kind of one of those things you look back and say, I definitely didn't know what I was getting into. Had I known it was going to be this hard or take this long or cost this much, then maybe we wouldn't have done it. But, you know, when it's all said and done, you look back and you got to be proud. And the fact that it's our own, there's a sense of pride and joy and kind of respect and humility that goes along with feeling like we are stewards of this place. Bob Hartwell could have sold this property to somebody else easily. I think the relationship with Benoit, you know, I remember vividly when he sat us down in his office and he essentially handed us the baton and said, you guys take it. So in some ways, I think all we're doing is finishing what the Hartwells started in terms of teasing out the full potential of this place. So we're probably in the 2nd or 3rd inning of what it will take to finish it entirely. We've got 3 acres out of, say, 20 or so replanted. So we've got a long way to go on the vineyard replant side, and we've got additional caves and winery work to do in the years ahead. But we knew that it was going to take a decade to do it. And so people get tired of, or more. I mean, I get tired of answering the question. They say, when's the construction going to be done? And I kind of am embarrassed to say, you know, never. But we're constantly tweaking. We're constantly learning. We learned a lot through the fires in 2017 that I think we've been able to engineer into the system in terms of resiliency and redundancy at this point going forward. So we're constantly tweaking. We got a long way to go, but we will pause. We just got our fire inspection today. So there was a big high five moment, like finally one inspection done. We'll take a pause the rest of the year. We'll focus on the harvest in front of us. And then we'll go back to the drawing board and start working on the next phase.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. Will the entire vineyard eventually be redeveloped?
Yes, with one caveat being when the Hartwells first planted the blocks up top, that they used cuttings from Grace Family Vineyard, and it was the old Bochet selection. That we've said we wanted to continue that and propagate that going forward. So even as we think about replanting everything, there's an eye towards thinking about the past and the heritage and trying to respect where some of that comes from.
Yeah, so for folks who don't know, I mean, that is a very famous clone in Napa Valley history, the Bochet clone from that vineyard in Rutherford. As I recall, it's one of the first single vineyard wines in Napa Valley.
Yep.
1970. And so is any of the are any of the redeveloped vineyards at Realm that clone, or did you put in new stuff?
The one behind is new stuff, but we are thinking, like, we're working on something that could lead to a micro estate within the estate with just Hazelet clone, Bochet clone, et cetera, et cetera. So
yeah, that's cool. Because that is very historical, as are other, you know. I mean, I think preserving the history of these things is really important for future generations. That way, you know, you can understand these. As you mentioned, Scott, the understanding of land in France is only about 500 years ahead.
Yeah.
Antonio, you will like that. We are talking about putting some Charbonneau Petit Syrah also to clean some budwoods from side that we love, like Torfanelli and the Ain Petit Syrah, and put like a few blocks of that as well.
Well, think about what he just said. Like, we're mostly planted. If you think about Napa now, it's everybody first thinks about Cabernet. But in the 60s and early 70s, there was more Petit Syrah planted in Napa Valley than there was Cabernet. Yeah. So as you think about those varietals going forward, especially if you start thinking about the context of climate change and other things, in some ways, it's almost like we're going back in time, or we're going back to the future. That I see those varietals playing a role in Napa again. And, you know, at some point, we'll stop talking about this as Bordeaux varietals, and we'll just start talking about it being a Napa Valley red blend. Which I think is part of this region finding its own identity, and it's partly respecting the past and the heritage, and it's then also looking to the future and saying, what should this place be in 10 or 20 years or a generation forward?
Yeah, I know, that's super cool. Which was a question from Raphael. I think this is a really, really useful question, which is, which of the red wines in the portfolio do you think is the most approachable young?
I would say Tempest, Merlot base. Typically, that's kind of the softer at the gate. Dembard. I think, you know, like for me, it's like with a proper decant, I drink young, whatever it's like, you know, Chardonnay from Burgundy to Napa Cab. So, and then I go to the very late 60s, 70s. I kind of skip the phase.
Okay.
Drink them young or drink them old.
Drink them young. Drink them, yeah, the Instagram, like.
Well, I'll tell you, it's really funny, you know, after spending the last 4 or 5 months doing these conversations with people from all over the world, that is a theme that that is the answer from a lot of people who make wine in a lot of parts of the world, which is, I think, is really interesting, you know, to either drink them really young or like after age 10 or so. It's really, it's amazing to get the same answer to the same question from people with completely different perspectives, regions, grapes that they work with. And so, I mean, there's some nice takeaways from Vinous Live. One of them is this kind of consensus that you either drink them young with a good decant or forget about them for, you know, 7 or 8 years.
I think it's really depends what people are looking for. For me, I like the complexity of the young age, and I don't mind the primary. And I'm not averse to tannins, so if I need to deal with it. So I think it depends the palate. And like we talked about just before, you know, wine is great right away. So to me, it's like, I don't want to miss. I don't want to have a Coke bottle. It's like, oh man, I don't want to pre-mux. Just, but I take it.
But I think in the context of Napa, you also have, specific to a young entrepreneurial developing wine region, a personality for the wines that still are with us from the 60s and even the 70s. And you can see a change in the 80s. You can see an evolution in the 90s. Maybe, you know, you could argue some wines went a little too far in the early 2000s. Now we're into the 2010s, and I think, you know, it's arguably the best decade Napa has had yet. But think about it's the cumulative knowledge of everything that's happened before us, and so it's hard to say that you're just tasting a specific wine's age. You're also tasting the evolution of an entire region, maybe a winemaker, maybe a producer, and their evolution of thought. And I think, you know, some of that might settle down over time as Napa gets more precise and more history. But yeah, I mean, I think we see that a lot. If we're tasting wines from 2007, we can all think back about that vintage, but it's not just the vintage that we're tasting. There was some stylistic choices made in 2007 that are just as influential in that wine as what Mother Nature did.
Yeah, you're too diplomatic to say it. And you also live in Napa Valley, but I live in New York and I can say it, that the 80s were the era of maximum kind of like stylized, highly interventional farming, lots of fining, filtration, and like very technical winemaking. And then in the 90s was kind of a revolution against that, with wines that were maybe more artisan, but the ripeness level was really pushed because that was just the style of the time. And I think you're right. A lot of it is eras are marked by these overarching themes, you know, and I mean, I remember when I first started coming out to Napa Valley on a regular basis that a lot of the local collectors would get together and everybody would bring these wines. And it was an incredible education. You know, you taste 30 or 40 great wines at once, iconic wines, and you could see these trends in these specific decades. So it's pretty interesting. You know, so speaking of that, I don't know, it was like last fall, my friends, I've got these crazy friends and they have a lot of your wines. And we did this like incredible tasting with like
our wines. They must be crazy, Antonio.
crazy. They're crazy, period. And they also buy a lot of your wines. But anyway, and I had some too. And so we did this really incredible tasting, which was like 60 wines. But there was one wine I had never tasted before, and it really blew me away. And it was a white wine. And so we have a question from James about the Sauvignon Blanc at Realm, which he says is under the radar and extraordinary, but it can be extraordinary. What is the story about your white wine? Because until last fall, I didn't even know this wine existed.
Well, we always keep a few surprises for you. Okay. I figured if you never liked our red wines, we'd leave the white in the pocket, and we'd only taste you on that in the future.
Okay.
You want to talk about Fidelio?
Yeah, Fidelio. So we do a Sauvignon Blanc 100%, and we source the grapes mostly like from Favela vineyards. And the techniques with the one was more like a dedication to Denis Dubourdieu. Like you may know, you certainly know him in Bordeaux. He was a teacher. So we try to find a way to prove that we can make like good Sauvignon Blanc, great Sauvignon Blanc from Napa Valley in a cooler sites. So sometimes we had access to grapes. So I was doing that with Hartwell, a vineyard in Carneros. And for us, we always love the Sauvignon Blanc. So it's been not known because it was small production, money sell direct. But always the research of acidity and purity, and Sauvignon Blanc was overlooked, to be honest, when I arrived in 2000, like early 2000 in Napa Valley. People were just making it, everything together, sell it right away. And I said, like, no, there's certainly, I mean, you heard about Screaming Eagle White, like there's some jewels, there was Spotwood, Arrowhead, Arietta. So there is a great, if you dig deeper, Napa is just not just cap. There's people doing great things on the white. And we've been inspired by that as well, so.
Yeah, and I think it's worth, just closing out with a mention of Farella and Coombsville, because this is the southernmost part of Napa Valley, now very much desired. I think partly it's because it's cooler, but I think there's also kind of a stylistic shift towards wines that have a little bit more of a savory profile. But Realm was one of the first, modern wineries to, of our generation to make fruit from there. What did you see in there that other people didn't? Because you were there or before other people.
I think it was
once or not.
Yeah, I mean, the real answer is Juan responded to an ad in Wine Country Classifieds back when that existed. But I give him a lot of credit because I think, that fruit, a lot of that was going to Opus One way back in the days. And as wine has evolved in Napa, I think, more and more of a focus on site and some of these smaller producers. And to have a cooler climate site, but to still have a west-facing slope, which I think if you think about our house style and the profile of our wines, we still need richness. We're looking for a fleshiness and from the fruit that, we don't mind the herbal characters and some of those savory things you mentioned about. But as you well know from a offline conversation you and I have had about pyrazines, that's not exactly our house style. And so that west-facing slope is unique because we get plenty of afternoon sun. So I think it was just recognizing that region and that vineyard had more potential than maybe what the wine market in general was thinking at the time. And, I think Frank Farella himself had been a mentor to me and a big part of my career development. And so the opportunity for us came up in 2018 to actually partner with the family and steward that vineyard for decades to come. And it just kind of cemented the Realm estate portfolio, and we'll be working on that vineyard in the same way we're thinking about Moonracer for decades to come. And I think you're right. It adds another complexity because the profile of wine from Coombsville, totally different than Stag's Leap, or if you think about Toquelin and Crane, you know, on the richer style of and the richer mouthfeel, denser wines, Farella gives us something totally different. And that's the whole point. At the end of the day, a sense of place that comes from a portfolio.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. It's always fun to taste the wines because of all of these different vineyards and really seeing the expression of each site through the wine and the vintage. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but we could be talking about this stuff for hours, and hopefully we will have a chance to do that in person because I'm kind of tired of these Zoom things. But I just want to thank you very much for your time this afternoon. It was really fun. Hopefully everybody watching got a lot out of it. I think we'll post this obviously on YouTube so people can watch it later, but it's always fun to just sort of chat and sort of understand a little bit of the story behind the wine, because ultimately wines always reflect the people who make them. So it's just been a real treat.
Well, thank you. It's fun to do it, and we'll look forward to seeing you out here soon.
All right. Cheers, guys. Have a nice evening.
Cheers to everyone that was watching.
Cheers.